Okay, welcome back, guys. We're going to continue with respiratory system. Um, Not too much more as far as in this particular unit and video. We didn't have a lot in the last one, so we're just going to continue building up. A little bit more anatomy stuff today, and then we're going to continue transitioning into more of the physiology realm of things. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on down. Okay, so this looks very overwhelming. There's a ton of information here, but I'm not expecting us to learn all of this. As we progress, we're going to learn roughly half of this stuff, but we're not going to get into crazy levels yet. So let's start off with the nasal cavity, aka the first major organ of the respiratory system. I just want to make sure we're comfortable with knowing where the nasal cavity is, so we are all aware this is all the nasal cavity up here. On that note, just so we're comfortable, it's interesting to me that when you look at the nose, like what we can physically see, very little of it, very little of it is actually physically outside, right? As far as the nose, like the nostrils and everything like that. But most of it is going to be built into the skull. Okay. So let's talk about that nasal cavity. Olfactory receptors are located in the mucosa of the superior surface. So what are these olfactory receptors? So first of all, the receptors are like, I think of them like satellites that orbit the earth. They pick up information and send it back, right? Receptors are like that, except they're picking up information of our surroundings, picking up information from our surroundings, sending it back to our brain so we can understand that we exist. Basically, it has to do with our senses. On that note of senses, olfactory is another word for, probably need this. Olfactory is another word for smell. So it is your sense of smell. And the way I remember olfactory, my mnemonic for this is I quite literally think of an old factory. Oops. So I quite literally think of an old factory smelling bad. That's an easy mnemonic for me to be like, oh, old factory, got it. The rest of the cavity is lined with this respiratory mucosa. The point of this respiratory mucosa is to help moisten the air. Again, the humidity in the air helps to thermoregulate, so maintain your body temperature. But it also traps incoming foreign particles. So it's going to trap anything that may harm your respiratory system and harm your lungs. And as a lot of us should be aware, right, if you are breathing something in that becomes an irritant and gets stuck in your nose, what are you going to do? Sneeze. The long story short about sneezing, and we'll talk more about it in this unit as we progress anyway, is if you got to sneeze, just do common basic etiquette stuff. Sneeze into your elbow, sneeze on towards the ground, sneeze away from people. You sneeze at roughly 100 miles per hour. That is way too fast for somebody to not get covered by your spit and your bacteria and your germs and your viruses. What else do we have in the nasal cavity? Well, let me just go ahead and show you guys real quick. We have these grooves right here, these little tiny grooves. Those are going to be the conchae. So let's talk about what those are. The conchae are these lateral walls that increase surface area. So they increase how much air can enter your nose. And they also increase air turbulence. So they actually increase the speed at which the air enters your nostrils. That's pretty important. Making sure that you get adequate amounts of air, important. The nasal cavity is separated from the oral cavity. So the nasal is separated from the oral cavity, nose and mouth, by the palates. You actually have two bones or two palates here, hard palate and a soft palate. The hard palate's going to be bone, and we learned this in our skeletal system stuff, actually. It's going to be the maxilla. The soft palate is going to be muscle, which you can physically feel if you press your tongue to the roof of the mouth. Okay, sinuses. I don't need us to worry about the specific names of each sinus. I want us to know what they do and what are they. So first of all, what is a sinus? A sinus is going to be a cavity found within the bones surrounding the nasal cavity. So they're literally holes found in the skull that surround the nose. There are 4 sinus locations: frontal, saphnoid, ethmoid, and maxillary. We talked about frontal and maxillary back in skeletal system. We never talked about saphnoid and ethmoid. Those are bones that make up your cheeks. So don't worry about that. This we do need to talk a little bit more about as far as the paranasal sinuses and their function. So what are the three major functions? Well, number one, because they're cavities, they're going to help lighten the weight of the skull. Okay. Number two, resonance chambers. This is very interesting. We're going to talk about speech more in our next video, but when you vibrate the vocal cords and that sound emits upward into your skull, that sound is going to bounce off of the sinuses. Sound always reverberates. It bounces off of its surfaces. And when it bounces off of surfaces, it changes sound. It changes how it sounds. So the best way that you can identify this is we all know how we sound, right? We've heard ourselves talk for years and years and years. But that's your voice. When you record yourself or you have someone record you talking and then play it back, it's going to sound different. It's going to sound different. And that's what your voice actually sounds like, which is pretty interesting. It's pretty cool to be able to identify that there's these two different voices that is your own voice, and it's because of resonance. What else do the sinuses do? Well, they also produce mucus. That's pretty important too. It's like a faucet. When you open the faucet, all the mucus pours out, right? And it's going to enter the nasal cavity. Granted, when a sinus gets infected, a number of things can happen, but one of the things that can occur is too much mucus. So the faucet's stuck on open. So too much mucus is going to make it that you just create an abundance of this stuff. And obviously that can be uncomfortable, that can cause runny nose, congestion, et cetera, et cetera. Next, pharynx, also known as the throat. The pharynx is a muscular passage from the nasal cavity all the way to the larynx. Quite literally, simple enough. If you swallow, you feel the pharynx making its way down. You feel the pharynx moving whatever you're swallowing. There are three regions of the pharynx that I do need us to know. So as far as the three regions are concerned, we have the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. The good news is, when learning these three, it's literally what is the prefix. That's all. You just got to pay attention to the prefix. So naso, oro, and laryngo. Okay, nasopharynx. I wonder where that is. It's right behind the nose, right? Nasal, nose. Superior region, so it's the top part of the pharynx. Oropharynx. Oro, it means oral, which is going to be mouth. So that's going to be right behind the mouth, which is the middle. Okay, sounds good. Laryngeal may be the only one that you're like, I've never seen that word before. And laryngeal is going to be right below the end of the pharynx, but right above the larynx. It's pretty much right above your Adam's apple. If you find your Adam's apple, it's a little bit above that. Pretty easy way to find it. The oropharynx and laryngopharynx are common passageways for air and food. Does that mean that you're never going to have food or liquids enter your nose? No, as a lot of us have experienced, that happens often. Let's say you're drinking something and suddenly something makes you laugh, burst out in laughter. Often it's going to shoot out your nose. It's all connected, right? Here's that picture again. Just want to make sure we're comfortable with some stuff. First off, I can just show you real quick. I'm just going to keep it to this color. Here we can see the sinuses, right? We can see two of them. We can't see all of them because of the angle. This is a side angle, right? As I'm looking this way. But you have frontal, and you can see the sphenoidal sinus as well. But we can also see the parts of the pharynx. So for instance, here is the beginning, the nasopharynx, right behind the nose. Let's change the color. Here we see the oropharynx, right behind the mouth. And then here we see the laryngopharynx, right above the Adam's apple, right before the larynx. So simply put, the pharynx is just one long tube that has different parts. So as long as we know which is which, that should be easy in the future. Shouldn't be too concerning. Okay, moving on. We now have some structures of the pharynx that we need to talk about. So let me show you guys, I'll kind of bounce back and forth between slides. In the pharynx, you have an auditory tube. Let me show you what it looks like. The auditory tube is right here. Very tiny, very, very small. The auditory tube is also known as the eustachian tube. We're going to learn more about that in senses, which is in quarter 3. But the long story short is you have a tube that connects your middle ear all the way to your throat. Why would you have a tube that connects the middle ear and the throat? It's to release pressure. And another way to tell that you have this connection between the throat and ears is that when you plug your nose and force air in, your ears pop. Tonsils. Tonsils. Let's talk about tonsils a little bit. A lot of us are familiar with tonsils because many of us have had our tonsils removed. But you have three sets of tonsils. You have the pharyngeal, palatine, and lingual. Here we can see what they look like. Right? You have your pharyngeal, palatine, and lingual. I don't need us to worry too much about tonsils. I'll talk about them so that we're comfortable with the material. But as far as tonsils are concerned, the pharyngeal are also known as adenoids. Interestingly enough, most people's adenoids go away, just degrade on their own after like ages 2 to 3. So most people don't even have them. And for those people that have them, some people have to be careful because sometimes the adenoids can actually become can cause issues with breathing, especially at night when you're sleeping. Palatine tonsils are the ones that you can see way back in the mouth, right? These are the tonsils that are going to be in the way back near the oropharynx region. As far as the palatine tonsils are concerned, these are ones that can swell pretty easily if you're sick. Same thing with your lingual tonsils. You typically don't see it under the tongue, but if you're sick, it can become pretty infected. Now, because of how easily infected tonsils can become, and their job is to hold on to any bacteria and germs and bad stuff that can harm you. So they're doing their job. But because of how easily infected they can become, sometimes it's easier for a physician to just make the decision and say, we just got to get rid of it. Tonsillectomy. Pretty straightforward. Okay, finally, to finish this up, we don't have too much left. Larynx. The larynx, also known as the voice box. That's a common name that it has. It's going to help route air and food into proper channels, plays a role in speech, hence why we call it the voice box. And it's made up of 8 rigid hyaline cartilages and a spoon-shaped flap of elastic cartilage. Speaking of, it's called the epiglottis, so let's talk about that. Near the Adam's apple, right under that, we have a butterfly-shaped structure called the thyroid. It is one of the most important glands that our body has, plays a major responsibility with metabolism. We're going to learn all about that in endocrine system, so we're good for now. But you have the Adam's apple that protrudes outward, where you have a buildup of cartilage. Real quick, side note, common myth that if you see a person and you can't identify their sex and you look at their Adam's apple, that tells you if they're male or female. Nope, there's no correlation with that. Just want to clear that up. Finally, epiglottis. The epiglottis is very important. This is one of the most important tissue found in the entire respiratory system. So it is the beginning of the larynx. It's like a little flap. It opens and closes depending on what's traveling down your throat. It's going to route food towards the larynx, and more specifically towards the esophagus, and then air towards the trachea. So I like to call the epiglottis, I have a little nickname for it, I like to call it the gatekeeper. I call it the gatekeeper. It literally opens and closes depending on what's coming, right? So for instance, if you're breathing, so if air is moving down the throat, the epiglottis must be open. It has to be. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to breathe. Where on the other hand, if you're eating or drinking, so in this case it would be food or liquid, the epiglottis is going to stay closed. And it makes sense. If you're eating or drinking something, it's going to travel down the pharynx, eventually reaching the larynx, and where the larynx is where the epiglottis is. The epiglottis is going to have that stuff slide off of it, and it's going to shoot down into what's called the esophagus. The esophagus is the tube that goes straight to the stomach. It is a digestive organ. We're going to learn all about that in the digestive system, so we don't really need to worry about it too much here. But knowing how the epiglottis opens and closes is very important. Okay. All right. So I think that's a great place for us to conclude for today. We'll just go ahead and erase some of our stuff here. But making good progress as far as respiratory system is concerned. Like I said, we're kind of starting off with more of the anatomy-based stuff, and then we're going to make our way into more physiology-based material. But I think that's a great place for us to conclude. Thanks, guys, for tuning in. I'll see you guys on the next one.